Late March, 1945. East of the main river, deep inside a country that is still the enemy's, a column of American tanks and half-tracks is grinding through the dark. There are only about 300 men in it. No division behind them. No secure road home. Nothing on either flank but German soil and German guns. They are pushing farther behind the lines than any American unit has any business going, and they are doing it because one man ordered it done. Roughly 50 miles ahead, behind the wire of a prison camp called XIII-B, near the small Bavarian town of Hammelburg, sit hundreds of captured American officers, starved down to bone, waiting out a war they can hear rolling closer but cannot reach. One of them is a lieutenant colonel named John Waters, and Waters has been a prisoner for more than 2 years. What almost none of the men in that column know, as they roll toward him through the night, is who Waters is married to. His wife is named Beatrice. Her father is General George S. Patton. This is the story of the raid Patton ordered to reach that camp. The young captain he handed it to. The men who drove 50 miles into a dying Reich to pull American prisoners out of it. And the question that has trailed the decision for 80 years. Was it a rescue? Or was it a father sending 300 men behind enemy lines to bring his daughter's husband home? Before we go on, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far this story travels. And if you're loving it so far, join the family by hitting subscribe. Because tomorrow, we've got something special lined up just for you. To understand the raid, you have to start with the man behind the wire, because everything that happened turned on him whether Patton admitted it or not. John Knight Waters was a West Point man, cavalry, the kind of officer who looked like the recruiting poster, and mostly lived up to it. He had married Beatrice Patton, the general's elder daughter, before the war, which made him more than a promising colonel. It made him family. By 1943, he was in North Africa, commanding armor in the green, badly handled American units that were about to meet Rommel's Afrika Korps for the first time in the Tunisian hills. That first meeting went the way first meetings with Rommel's veterans usually went. In February of 1943, on the open ground around Sidi Bou Zid, the German armor came out of the morning haze and took the American tank units apart. The Americans had the numbers on paper and the confidence of men who had not yet been hit. The Germans had experience, better tactics, and better guns, and they used all three. Whole formations were surrounded, tanks burned across the plain. It was the opening act of the disaster the American army would remember by the name of the pass just behind it, Kasserine, the place where the United States learned, at brutal cost, that wanting to win a tank battle was not the same as knowing how. Waters was in the middle of it, commanding armor, and when the ground gave way and the units around him were cut off, he and much of his command were overrun. He was taken prisoner in that first bad week, one of thousands of Americans the desert swallowed before the army found its feet. For Patton, who took over that same beaten American corps only weeks later and shook it back into a fighting force, it was personal on 2 counts. The men were his to rebuild, and one of the men the Germans had carried off was married to his daughter. Waters would not see the outside of a German camp again for more than 2 years, and Patton would carry that fact, quietly, all the way across North Africa, Sicily, France, and into Germany. 2 years is a long time to be a prisoner, long enough to watch a war you were supposed to be winning move on without you. Waters was shuttled through the German prison system the way captured officers were, from camp to camp, and by the last winter of the war he had ended up at XIII-B, outside Hammelburg, in the part of Bavaria called Franconia. And Oflag was an officer's camp. The men in it were mostly lieutenants, captains, majors, and colonels. A great many of them Americans taken in the Battle of the Bulge only a few months earlier, still stunned to be there at all. Waters had spent those 2 years as the kind of prisoner other prisoners looked to, a senior officer who held himself together and helped hold others together through the long grind of captivity. He had gone into the bag in the first disaster of America's war, and had waited out most of the rest of it, close enough by early 1945 to hear the guns of the army his father-in-law was driving east. He did not know, as he listened to them get closer, that one of those columns was about to be sent straight at him, or what it would cost. The camp was not a death factory. It was something quieter, and, by the spring of 1945, almost as lethal. Germany was collapsing. The rail network was rubble. Fuel and food that were scarce for German soldiers barely existed for prisoners at the bottom of the priority list. The men at Oflag XIII-B were living on thin turnip soup and a ration of bread that kept shrinking, and they were disappearing inside their own uniforms, a pound at a time. Dysentery moved through the barracks. Men who had been strong company officers a year before now shuffled the compound slowly, conserving what little they had, counting days. The camp held a mix of nationalities. There were Serbian officers who had been prisoners since the German conquest of Yugoslavia years earlier, long-term captives who had built a rough order out of survival, and among them were trained doctors. That is the small detail that will matter enormously before this is over. And there were the Americans, many of them fresh, taken only that winter when the Germans had smashed into the Ardennes in the Battle of the Bulge. Officers who had gone from the confidence of an advancing army to a starving Bavarian compound in a matter of weeks, and were still adjusting to the size of the fall. Holding them together was Colonel Paul Good, the senior American in the camp, a calm and respected officer the prisoners called Pop. His job was the hardest kind. Keep several hundred hungry, frightened, restless men disciplined, sane, and alive, with no power except the authority they granted him, until the war finally reached the wire. And the war was reaching a lot of wire that spring, which is worth understanding, because it sat underneath Patton's later justification. In the final weeks of the Reich, the German camp system was in motion. As the fronts closed in from east and west, prisoners were being marched away from the advancing armies, sometimes for hundreds of miles, in long columns through the cold, with little food and less mercy. Men who had survived years of captivity died on those roads in the last months of the war. Camps in the path of the Allied advance were emptied, moved, or simply abandoned, and no prisoner could be certain, hearing the guns get closer, whether liberation or one more forced march was coming. That was the real and ugly backdrop. A commander who believed American prisoners were about to be moved or killed as the front collapsed was not imagining a danger. The danger was everywhere. The question, in Hammelberg's case, was whether that danger was the real reason for what Patton did, or the cover for it. Now move west, out of the camp and up the chain, to the man giving the orders. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the last week of March 1945, George Patton's Third Army was doing what Patton did best, which was move. Only days before, on the night of March 22nd, his men had thrown a crossing over the Rhine at Oppenheim, slipping over the last great natural barrier into the German heartland, while the rest of the Allied command was still organizing its own crossings. Patton had done it fast and quietly, with assault boats and speed and a minimum of the artillery preparation that doctrine prescribed. And to his enormous satisfaction, he had beaten Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's elaborate set-piece crossing to the north by a full day. He had wanted to be across the Rhine before the British, and he was. And he made certain that Eisenhower and everyone else who mattered knew it before the morning was out. Now the last serious geographic obstacle between his army and the interior of Germany was behind him, and there was very little in front. What was in front was a country coming apart at its seams. The German army in the west was no longer a continuous defensive front, so much as a collection of isolated pockets, improvised scratch units, assembled from whoever was still standing, boys who had been in uniform for weeks, alongside old men who had been recalled from retirement, and the occasional hardcore of veterans who would still fight to the finish, for reasons that were becoming harder to name as the war's outcome clarified around them. Roads were choked with refugees moving west, and surrendering soldiers moving toward whatever American unit they could find first. Towns hung white sheets from their windows as the tanks approached, the sheets appearing sometimes before the lead vehicles had even turned the corner. Patton's columns were covering ground so fast that the supply trucks and the cartographers and the radio networks struggled to keep pace. And Patton did not care, because he could feel the end coming, and he intended to be as deep inside Germany as possible, having taken as much as possible when it arrived. He was not a man who slowed down when an enemy was breaking. He was a man who pressed harder, because he understood that the moment between an enemy beginning to break and an enemy completing the break was the moment when pressure multiplied its own effect, and that a commander who eased off in that moment was leaving victories on the table that would cost blood to recover later. It was in the middle of that headlong drive east, with his army racing across Bavaria and a war visibly within reach, that Patton learned, or decided he had learned, that his son-in-law was being held in a prisoner of war camp near a small German town called Hammelburg, roughly 50 miles beyond his forward units. What exactly he knew, and precisely when he knew it, is one of the most genuinely disputed questions in this entire episode, and we will come back to it directly. What is beyond dispute is the decision that followed. He resolved to send a force to go and bring the prisoners out. The idea was not, on its face, without military logic. Armored units operating in a fluid front had liberated camps before, without needing special justification. The German rear was thinning by the hour as the defensive structure collapsed, and a fast, hard-hitting armored column punching through the confusion, reaching an objective, collecting prisoners, and driving back before German forces could organize a coherent response, was exactly the kind of stroke Patton loved, and, in the right circumstances, exactly the kind of thing his Third Army was built to execute. Speed and violence of action were the tools that had carried his army from Normandy to the Rhine, and there was reasonable argument that those tools still applied. The trouble was the distance and the size of the force being proposed, and the men closest to the planning understood the problem immediately. The mission went to the 4th Armored Division, one of the finest fighting formations in the American Army, by the spring of 1945. The unit that had been Patton's sharpest instrument for the better part of a year. Inside that division, a combat command was led by a colonel named Creighton Abrams, a tank officer of such exceptional ability that the United States Army would eventually name its main battle tank after him. When the mission came down through the chain of command, Abrams and the officers around him looked at the tactical arithmetic. 50 miles into enemy territory through a rear area of unknown composition. An unconfirmed number of prisoners at the objective. German forces of uncertain strength, not just between the column and the camp, but on every side of the route and around the objective itself. Their professional judgment was unambiguous. If this mission was going to be done at all, it needed to be done with serious force. A full combat command. Hundreds of vehicles. Enough firepower to drive in, establish a perimeter, load whoever could be loaded, and fight back out through whatever tried to close the door behind them. Patton said no. He wanted the force small and fast. A smaller column could move quicker, slip through the gaps in a collapsing front, attract less attention from whatever German command structure was still functioning, and get home before the situation around it could consolidate into something dangerous. A large force would be a slow and obvious thrust that every available German unit in the region would move to intercept. There is a version of that reasoning that is sound tactical judgment from a general who had spent 30 years thinking about mobile warfare and understood better than most how chaos could be exploited by speed. There is another version in which a smaller force also happened to be one Patton could authorize with considerably less scrutiny from above, because diverting a full combat command 50 miles off the Army's axis of advance to liberate a single camp would have generated questions from Eisenhower's headquarters that Patton did not want to be asked to answer. Both versions have their serious defenders in the historical literature. The men who actually executed the mission did not have the luxury of debating either. They had their orders. The mood inside the 4th Armored around this mission was not enthusiasm. These were not inexperienced troops who could be carried forward on the energy of an inspiring briefing. They were veterans of a year of mechanized combat across France and into Germany. Men who had developed a precise and unsentimental sense of what armored operations could accomplish and what they could not. And the arithmetic here was ugly by any honest reading. 50 miles out and 50 miles back, through a rear area that was disorganized but far from empty, to an objective whose exact layout and defending strength were unknown, with no relief force, no secured route, and no realistic mechanism for reinforcement if the column ran into more resistance than it could handle on its own. The officers who would send the column out understood, in the flat and specific way that experienced soldiers understand such things before difficult operations, that they were very likely sending most of it to destruction. Some of them said as much to each other, in the way soldiers say such things before operations they cannot call off. And then they went to work planning it anyway, because the order had come from Patton, and when Patton had decided that something was going to happen, the argument about whether it should happen was already finished. The force was drawn from 2 of the division's veteran battalions, the 10th Armored Infantry and the 37th Tank, units that had fought the whole distance from the breakout at Avranches across France and into Germany. and knew their business as well as any formation in the American Army. The natural choice to command the column was the infantry battalion's own commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named Harold Cohen. Cohen wanted the assignment. He also had a fever and was in genuine physical misery, in no condition to lead a running fight across 50 miles of uncertain ground. Creighton, Abrams, and Cohen looked at their available officers, and the choice fell on a captain from Cohen's battalion. His name was Abe Baum. He was 24 years old. Before the war, he had worked in New York City's garment trade, a Jewish kid from the Bronx who had come a very long way from the fabric district to the command of an armored task force pointed at the heart of the country that had spent the preceding 12 years industrializing the murder of people exactly like him. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it matters. It is the last month of the war in Europe. The American army is days away from throwing open the gates of the concentration camps and showing the world, in photographs that no one who saw them would forget, what the Nazi state had built and operated for 12 years. And the officer selected to drive a column 50 miles into the center of that state, on a mission that stood a serious probability of ending in his death or capture, was a young Jewish American who did not need anyone to explain to him what capture in this particular country might mean for him specifically. He took the mission without asking to be excused from it. He was told the operational outline. He was not told all of it. He was told there were American prisoners at Hammelburg, that his task force would reach the camp, free the men, and bring them back. He was not told plainly that the reason this column was being sent at all, the reason a general commanding an army in the final weeks of a winning war, was diverting resources from the main advance for a 50-mile raid into uncertain ground, was that the general's son-in-law was reportedly among the prisoners at the far end. Baum would piece that together later, from the evidence that accumulated on the far side of what came next. On the night the column rolled, he had a mission, a map, and a professional understanding, shared by every man in the formation, that the force was too small for what it was being asked to do. Task Force Baum assembled quickly. Roughly 300 men, a column of Sherman tanks and light tanks, half-tracks carrying infantry, a handful of self-propelled guns, jeeps, and a medical vehicle. Somewhere around 60 vehicles in total. A hard and capable little force. Veterans mostly. Men who had earned their competence the expensive way. But 60 vehicles pointed 50 miles into enemy territory, with no anchor behind them, and no way to be reached if the road back closed, is not a raid. It is a gamble on the assumption that nothing serious is waiting in the space between here and there. Every man in that column understood the odds they were being asked to accept. They rolled out anyway, because that is what soldiers do when the order comes, and the argument is over, and because Baum had the mission and the map, and because somewhere 50 miles east, there were American prisoners who did not know that a column too small for the job was coming to bring them home. On the night of March 26, 1945, they went. Getting out of the American lines was the easy part. Getting through the German ones was where it started. The task force had to punch through the enemy's forward positions near the front, and the Germans there, thin as they were, did not simply wave them through. There was fighting from the first hours. Muzzle flashes in the dark, the column shooting its way past defended points, and rolling on before the enemy could react in force. That was the whole theory of the raid. Speed. Do not stop to win the fight. Break contact and keep driving east. They drove through the night and into the day. Deeper into country, no American vehicle had touched. Small towns, river crossings, roads that turned into ambushes, and roads that were mercifully empty. The Germans behind them were waking up now, and word was moving up the enemy chain that an American armored column was loose in the rear, driving hard for no reason anyone could immediately understand. That word would kill most of these men before it was over. There was a fight at a river town where the Germans blew a bridge in the column's face, forcing Baum to find another way across, and costing him time and vehicles he could not spare. There was more fighting at other crossings and other towns. A running series of sharp actions where the task force traded shots, lost men and machines, and pressed on. Every mile east was a mile farther from help and a mile deeper into a region where German strength, scattered as it was starting to gather around the intruder. For the men in the tanks and half-tracks, the raid was hours of a very particular kind of strain. They were driving hard through the dark in a country where every road sign might be a trap, and every tree line might hide a gun, navigating by map and instinct, because there was no one out ahead of them to say what was around the next bend. They were the point of the spear, and the whole spear at once, with nothing behind them. Crews went without sleep, ran on adrenaline, and coffee and fear, and kept their eyes moving, because the first sign of the next ambush was usually the muzzle flash that started it. There is a specific loneliness to being the only friendly force for 50 miles in any direction, and these men felt all of it, mile after mile, knowing the odds and driving into them anyway, because that was the job, and the job did not care about the odds. The character of the fight kept shifting as they drove, and in some villages the column rolled straight through streets hung with white flags, the war apparently over for the people watching from doorways. In the next, it took fire from a hidden gun or a knot of soldiers who had not gotten the message that Germany was finished. The task force could not stop to clear these places properly. Stopping was death, so it shot its way through and kept its speed up, leaving fights half-finished behind it, trading the safety of a cleared road for the safety of momentum. Fuel was the quiet enemy the whole time. Tanks and half-tracks drink gasoline at a frightening rate, and there is no supply convoy 50 miles inside enemy country. The column scavenged what it could and watched its gauges, because a dry tank behind German lines is not a vehicle, it is a coffin. Ammunition drained the same way, spent in a dozen sharp roadside actions that used up rounds that could not be replaced. Every fight the task force won cost it a little more of the fuel and the ammunition it would need to survive the fight that was still coming for it. And the enemy was no longer just the scattered units on the road. Higher up the German chain, staff officers were now tracking the raid with growing understanding, plotting its course, and doing the one thing that would prove fatal to Baum and his men. They were working out where the column had to be going, and where it would have to come back through, and they began moving real forces, guns and armor, to be waiting on that road. The Germans had absorbed the shock of the intrusion. Now they were setting the trap. By the afternoon of March 27th, Task Force Baum was close to Hammelburg, and behind the wire at Aufleg XIII-B, the prisoners could hear it coming. Put yourself inside that camp for a moment. You are an American officer. You have been a prisoner for months, in some cases for years. You are hungry in the chronic, deep way that men become hungry when they have been underfed for long enough that the body has started accommodating the deficit as a new baseline. And now, out to the west, you can hear American tank guns, not artillery rumbling in the distance, the background percussion of a war being fought somewhere else. Tank fire, the flat hard crack of it, direct and close, and getting closer, until it is not in the distance at all. It is right outside the wire. Men climbed to anything that gave them a sight line. Word tore through the barracks, the way important information tears through a confined space. Instantly, in all directions at once. The war was not coming someday. It was here, now, at the fence. Then the shells started landing inside the camp. This is one of the most difficult and most truthful parts of the whole story, and it cannot be softened without falsifying what actually happened. As Task Force Baum fought its way up to the camp through the German defenses on the perimeter, some of the fire came down on the prison compound itself. Whether the rounds landing inside the wire were German fire, American fire, or both in the layered confusion of a close-quarters fight, men inside were hit. Prisoners who had survived months or years of captivity were wounded and killed in the last hour before their liberation, by the battle that was supposed to free them. War does not save its cruelty for the enemy, and it does not pause at the wire of a prison camp because the men inside are already suffering enough. For the prisoners, those minutes were a particular kind of torment. They had kept themselves alive through every cold and hungry night of captivity, partly by holding on to the idea of this exact sound, American guns coming to get them. Now the sound was real, and the shells were landing among them, and their friends were going down beside them, and nobody knew, in those minutes, whether the next hour ended in liberation or in something much worse, because both outcomes were entirely possible, and the difference between them was being decided outside the wire by men and events that the prisoners could not see and could not influence. The guards were unsure whether to fight, to flee, or to turn on the prisoners in the confusion, which was its own kind of danger distinct from the shells. Some prisoners pressed themselves into the dirt of the barracks floor. Some crowded to the wire to see. Men who had held themselves together through years of captivity found themselves, in those specific minutes, closer to dying than they had been at any point since they were taken. Underscore. The senior American officers inside the camp understood what was happening outside, and understood the most immediate danger. An armored column was about to try to take the camp by force. If it came to a hard fight at the wire, the guards might start shooting prisoners, or the prisoners would be caught in concentrated crossfire with nowhere to go. The situation needed to be resolved quickly, before the fight became what it was threatening to become. Someone needed to go out and arrange a surrender of the camp while there was still time for a surrender to save lives. Colonel John Waters volunteered. He did not have to. He was a senior officer, a prisoner of war, entitled by every rule and convention to stay where he was and wait for events to resolve themselves. Instead, he agreed to walk out through the gate under a white flag, accompanied by a German officer, to make contact with the approaching Americans and arrange the handover of the camp in a way that stopped the shooting before it consumed everyone on both sides of the wire. It was the officer's decision, the right decision, the decision that might save lives that would otherwise be spent for no purpose in the last hour of a captivity that was already ending. He walked out toward the fighting with nothing but a flag of truce. And somewhere in the confusion on the perimeter, a German guard either did not see the flag or chose not to honor it, and shot him. Waters went down badly wounded, hit through the hip with the bullet traveling into the region of the spine, the kind of wound that in that place and that year killed most of the men who received it. He was carried back inside the camp, and here, the small detail established earlier in this story becomes the difference between his death and his survival. Among the Serbian officers held at XIII-B was a trained surgeon. On a makeshift operating surface, with the instruments and supplies available in a prisoner of war camp, that Serbian doctor operated on John Waters and kept him alive. The general's son-in-law, the man whose presence at Hammelburg, some would later argue was the reason 50 miles of men and vehicles were committed to this raid, was saved not by the task force and not by the American army, but by a captured Yugoslav surgeon in a starving camp, performing surgery under conditions that no surgeon in a functioning hospital would have considered acceptable. Task Force Baum took the camp. The wire came down. The guards were overwhelmed or surrendered in the minutes after Waters was shot and carried back inside. And in the moment the task force had driven 50 miles and bled for, the moment the gate opened, Abe Baum learned the fact that transformed a dangerous mission into an impossible one. He had been told there were a few hundred prisoners at Hammelburg. There were roughly 1,500. It is difficult to fully convey what that number did to the mission in a single instant of recognition. The entire operational plan, the size of the force Patton had authorized, the number of vehicles in the column, the whole calculation of what could realistically be carried out 50 miles back through enemy territory, had been built on the assumption of a few hundred men. Finding more than 1,000 additional prisoners did not expand the raid's success. It collapsed the mission's mathematics entirely, because now Baum was standing in a liberated camp he had no way to evacuate, deep inside enemy territory, with the Germans already closing behind him, and 1,500 desperate men looking at his vehicles and seeing the only path between themselves and continued captivity. 1,500 half-starved men, many of them too weak from months of inadequate food to walk any serious distance, all of them reaching toward freedom with the energy of people who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Pressing toward a column of combat vehicles that had barely carried enough capacity for a fraction of their number. Vehicles that were already crude and already low on fuel and ammunition after 50 miles of fighting through German positions. Every additional man loaded on a tank or a half-track made that vehicle heavier, slower, and more vulnerable. Every vehicle that filled with liberated prisoners was a vehicle that lost some portion of its ability to fight back through whatever was between them and American lines. Baum had minutes, not hours, to make the calculation that Creighton Abrams had seen coming from the beginning. He could not carry 1,500 men. He could not carry 500. He could carry the men who could physically get onto the available vehicles, without destroying the column's ability to function as a fighting force. And he could do it in the time the tactical situation was allowing him, which was shrinking by the minute. The prisoners understood that freedom was 50 impossible miles away, and reached for it with everything they had left. Some climbed onto the tanks and the half-tracks, and any surface that would hold them. Some who understood the odds and still could not make themselves stay behind, set out on foot into the German rear, walking west on legs that months of captivity had not prepared for the walk. because moving toward American lines felt more survivable than waiting behind wire for a liberation that had not quite arrived yet. Most had to be left at the camp to wait for the main army advancing behind Baum's column, watching the task force that was supposed to save them form back up to leave, with only a fraction of the men it had come to free. Officers who had shared 2 years of hunger together shook hands in the dark of March 27th and split in different directions. Some toward the vehicles, some toward the fields and the roads, none of them with enough information to know which choice was the one that would keep them alive. Baum made the brutal call that the situation forced on him, loaded who he could load while keeping the column capable of fighting, and turned it around to run for home. And by then, the thing that Abrams and his officers had feared from the moment the mission was handed down was fully in motion. The door behind them was closing. While Task Force Baum had been fighting east and liberating the camp, the German command structure had been doing what German commanders still did with frightening competence even in the late stages of a losing war. They were reacting. Units were being assembled and directed. The word of an American armored column, operating 50 miles into the German rear, had reached commanders who had a fix on where it was, and, more importantly, on where it had to go, because there was only one direction home for Baum, and everyone on both sides understood what that direction was. At Hammelburg itself, German forces included troops and instructors from a nearby military training area. Men who knew the local ground the way people know ground they have trained on for years. To them, higher command rushed additional armor and anti-tank guns, moving to occupy the high ground the column would have to pass to reach American lines. They set up in the darkness on the terrain that favored them, with overlapping fields of fire covering the route the column had to use, and they waited. The tactical situation that Baum was driving his exhausted column toward was everything Abrams had predicted, and nothing that could be overcome with the resources the task force had left. No artillery to break up dug-in positions on high ground, no air support in the darkness, no reinforcements that could reach them in time to matter. Fuel and ammunition worn down by 100 miles of round-trip fighting through contested territory. A column carrying liberated prisoners on its exterior surfaces, which complicated every tactical decision and constrained every option that would have required the vehicles to fight at full capacity. A concentrated enemy force, dug in on ground of its choosing, waiting with anti-tank weapons and armor, against a lone and depleted column with nothing left to draw on and nowhere to call for help. It is not a battle so much as a conclusion being written out in real time. The men of Task Force Baum fought as hard as men can fight, in a situation where the arithmetic has already been decided. Some broke through in small groups, and made it to American lines individually, filtering back through the darkness on foot, after the vehicles were gone. Most did not. The task force that had rolled out 50 miles to bring prisoners home became prisoners itself before March 28th was finished. Baum was wounded and captured. The column that had been too small for the mission from the moment Abrams looked at the map was gone, and the men who had ridden it into the German rear were now inside their own wire, waiting for the liberation that the main army would eventually bring. Waters survived. The Serbian surgeon's work held, and when the 14th Armored Division reached Hammelburg several days later as part of the regular advance, Waters was evacuated and treated and eventually recovered. He lived until 1989. Baum was liberated when Hammelburg fell to American forces in the days following the raid. He went home after the war and returned to the garment trade in New York. The Bronx kid who had taken the mission nobody else was being asked to take, and had driven it as far as it could be driven, before the mathematics of the thing closed around him. Patton never publicly acknowledged that his son-in-law was the reason for the raid. In his memoir, he described it as a straightforward attempt to liberate American prisoners, an operation that would have been mounted regardless of who was held at Hammelburg. Most of the people who knew him did not believe this, and most historians writing about it since have not believed it either. The evidence, taken together, points in one direction with a consistency that is hard to explain any other way. What is certain is that Task Force Baum was too small, that the men who planned it knew it was too small, that the men who executed it knew it was too small, and that it was too small anyway, rolling east into 50 miles of uncertainty on a March night, because Patton had decided it was going to happen. And when Patton decided something was going to happen, the argument was finished. The men who did not come back carried that decision with them into captivity, and beyond it, into the rest of their lives, which were shaped in ways that the raid's planners did not calculate and would not have to answer for. That is the whole shape of Task Force Baum. Not the story of a daring rescue that came close, but fell short. The story of a mission sent without enough to succeed, for reasons that the man who sent it was never fully willing to name. Executed by men who understood the odds and went anyway. Because the order had come and the argument was over, and somewhere out there in the dark were Americans behind wire, who deserved whatever chance could be given them, even a chance this thin. On the night of March 27th into the 28th, only a few miles from the camp, and still an ocean of enemy territory from safety, Task Force Baum drove into the trap. On the high ground the Germans opened up, and in the darkness the column was torn apart. Anti-tank fire found the Shermans. Vehicles burned. The neat column dissolved into a running, burning fight across wooded hills. Men fighting out of stricken tanks. Half-tracks catching fire with prisoners still aboard. The whole force coming apart under fire it could not answer, and could not escape. Baum was wounded again in the fighting, hit and hit again. His command was destroyed around him. What had rolled out of the American lines as a hard little fist of 60 vehicles and 300 men ended as scattered knots of survivors in the German night, most of them dead, wounded, or about to be captured. For the men who lived through the ambush, the war became very small and very immediate. There was no column anymore, no mission, only burning vehicles lighting the trees, and the simple problem of staying alive until morning, in the middle of an enemy that now had every reason to hunt them down. Men crawled out of dead tanks and moved off into the dark in ones and twos and small groups, trying to walk 50 miles west through a country entirely held by the people trying to kill them. Some were run down within hours. Some hid in barns and woods by day and moved by night. Half starved themselves now, and a scattered handful actually made it, staggering into American lines days later, with the story of what had happened out beyond the front. Most did not. They were killed in the hills around Hammelburg, or rounded up and marched back into captivity. And the freed prisoners who had climbed aboard the vehicles, or set out on foot, were, for the most part, simply recaptured. Their few hours of freedom ending where they had started, behind German wire. Abe Baum was captured. And here the story turns a final, bitter circle, because there was only one place nearby to put captured Americans. The Germans took the wounded Baum back to XIII-B, the very camp he had driven 50 miles and destroyed his command to liberate. The captain who had led the raid ended it as a prisoner behind the same wire, lying wounded among the men he had failed to bring out. If you wrote it in a film script, an editor would tell you it was too much. It happened. For a few days, that was the end of it. A destroyed task force. A camp full of prisoners who had watched their rescue arrive and then be annihilated. A general's son-in-law fighting for his life on a Serbian doctor's table. And roughly 300 of Patton's men killed, wounded, or captured on a raid that had freed no one, at least not yet. Then the actual front arrived. In the first days of April 1945, the real weight of the American advance reached Hammelburg. This time it was not a lone column 50 miles out on a limb. It was the front itself, and specifically the 14th Armored Division, rolling up on the camp as part of the broad advance that was now overrunning southern Germany wholesale. On or around the 6th of April, they liberated XIII-B for good. The guards were gone or taken. The wire came down and stayed down. The prisoners who had been recaptured, and the many hundreds who had never been able to leave in the first place, were finally, actually free, this time with an entire advancing army behind the men who opened the gate. They found Baum there, wounded, a captured captain who turned out to have led one of the strangest missions of the war. They found Colonel Good, and the surviving officers. And they found John Waters, alive, kept breathing by that Serbian surgeon through the worst of it. Waters was evacuated to proper medical care. Against the odds of the wound he had taken, he lived. So the prisoners of Hammelburg were freed. Waters was saved. Baum survived and would go home. In the narrowest possible sense, the thing Patton had wanted came true. But it came true because the whole American army arrived a week and a half later, not because of the raid, and the raid itself had bought that outcome at the price of an entire task force. Nearly everything the mission had cost, it had cost for nothing that the ordinary advance would not have delivered anyway, on its own, a few days on. The army seems to have quietly absorbed that lesson, because nothing quite like it was tried again in those final weeks. There were other camps, other prisoners, other chances for a bold dash behind the lines. and the advancing armies mostly reached them the ordinary way, at the front's own pace, without flinging a lone task force out into the dark to be cut off. Hammelburg stood as a hard, specific example of what happens when a raid outruns everything that can support it, and the price of that example was paid in full by the men of Task Force Baum, who never got the clean rescue their courage deserved. That is the part that made the aftermath so ugly. Word of the raid and its destruction went up the chain, and it did not go up quietly. Patton's superiors were not pleased. General Omar Bradley, Patton's Army Group commander, and General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, were both aware of what had happened, and the shape of it was not good. A veteran task force wiped out, roughly 300 men lost. A camp reached and then lost again. And underneath it all, the uncomfortable, persistent fact that the general who ordered the raid had a son-in-law in the camp. That fact is the hinge of the entire historical argument. So let us look straight at it. Patton always insisted that he did not send the raid to rescue Waters personally. His public position, and the one he put in writing after the war, was that he believed the camp held a few hundred American prisoners in danger of being moved or harmed as the front collapsed, and that reaching them was worth the risk. He claimed he did not know for certain that Waters was among them until afterward. That was his story, and he stuck to it. Almost no one who has studied the raid closely believes he had no idea. The circumstantial weight runs the other way. Patton knew his son-in-law was a prisoner. He had reason to believe he was in that region. He diverted a force 50 miles off his axis of advance to reach one specific camp among the many the Third Army was liberating without special effort. Even some of the officers involved came to believe, and later said, that the personal connection was central to the whole thing. The kindest honest reading is that Patton may have half convinced himself of his own official version, the way people do when the thing they want lines up with a thing they can justify. The event does not require you to think him a villain. It only requires you to notice that a commander sent other men's sons to die reaching a camp that happened to hold his own family, and then told the world it was strictly a military decision. Patton, for his part, was unrepentant about the concept, even as he acknowledged the failure. In his own account of the war, written before his death, he addressed Hammelburg directly, and the striking thing is what he admitted the mistake to be. He did not say the mistake was ordering the raid at all. He said, in effect, that his error was sending too small a force, that he should have committed more strength to it. In other words, the man looked back at a wiped-out task force and 300 lost soldiers, and concluded that the lesson was, he should have risked even more men. You can hear in that either the pure aggressive logic that made him a great combat commander, or the inability of a certain kind of man to ever conclude that the bold stroke itself was wrong. People have heard both. They still do. To be fair to the man, that same refusal to accept limits was exactly what had made Patton great. Only 3 months earlier, in the snow of the Ardennes, he had done something most generals said could not be done, wheeling his army 90 degrees in the dead of winter and driving north to break through to the surrounded defenders of Bastogne. The aggression that produced the relief of Bastogne and the aggression that produced the disaster at Hammelburg were the same trait, running in the same man, pointed at different problems. That is the uncomfortable thing about a commander like Patton. You do not get the general who reaches Bastogne without also getting the general who sends 300 men 50 miles for a camp he should have let the front reach on its own. The boldness was not a switch he could throw off when it stopped being useful. It was simply who he was, and at Hammelburg, it cost a task force. For years, the raid was something the army did not much want to discuss. A wiped-out task force sent 50 miles to a camp, holding the commanding general's son-in-law, was not a story anyone in a position to shape the record was eager to publicize. And so Hammelburg slid into the footnotes, mentioned briefly, explained quickly, moved past. The fuller account came later, most of it from the survivors themselves, above all from Baum, who lived a long life, and when he was finally asked plainly saw no reason to protect the official version. The men who had driven those 50 miles had earned the right to say what the mission had actually been about, and in time, they said it. Abraham Baum came out of the final ambush shot through and a prisoner, and then, days later, a free man again when the front rolled over the camp that held him. He recovered. His country gave him the Distinguished Service Cross for what he and his men had done and endured on that road. He went home, built an ordinary life, and carried the raid with him through a long one. Of everyone who could have spent the following decades polishing the legend or burying the truth, the man who had actually led the column did neither. He told it as it was. John Waters, the wounded son-in-law at the center of the whole thing, made the fullest recovery of anyone. He came back from a wound that should have killed him, stayed in the army, and rose steadily through the decades that followed. The lieutenant colonel shot under a white flag at a Bavarian prison camp, eventually wore 4 stars. General John K. Waters. Whatever else the raid was, the man it was arguably launched to save went on to a long and distinguished career of his own. The roughly 300 men of Task Force Baum did not get to share that quota. Patton drove on, and won his war, ended the campaign as one of the most celebrated commanders in American military history, and then died, in December of 1945, months after the guns went silent, in a low-speed car accident on a quiet road in occupied Germany. The most aggressive fighting general the American Army produced in that war, survived every risk he ran at the front, and was killed by a collision on an ordinary December afternoon. He never had to give a full public accounting of Hammelburg. History has been arguing about it in his place ever since. Some historians make the case that the raid was defensible. Camps were being emptied and prisoners were dying in those final weeks. And a commander willing to take risks to free his own men is doing his job. The fact that one of those men was family does not by itself make the decision wrong. Bold raids fail. Judging a gamble only by its outcome is judging every gamble a fool who happens to lose. Others argue the numbers never made sense. That a 50-mile thrust with 300 men to reach a camp the front would liberate within days was reckless on its face. That personal motive corrupted military judgment, and that a general spent other people's sons on an errand of the heart he was unwilling to name. What is not in dispute is what happened. 300 men went 50 miles. They freed the camp and found 5 times the prisoners they could carry. The task force was destroyed on the way home. A week and a half later, the ordinary advance of the army liberated everyone who had been left behind. 80 years on, the question the raid asks has not gotten easier. If you were Patton, and your daughter's husband was behind that wire, would you have sent them? If you've been watching this channel for a while, and still haven't subscribed, now is the moment. Hit the button, turn on the notification bell, and join the community. We are here every day, with the military history stories that deserve to be told straight, without softening what was hard, and without forgetting what was, in its own way, exactly right. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the veterans, and never forget what they were fighting against. We will see you in the next video.